All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we look at a map, it's super easy to gloss over Micronesia as just a handful of remote dots in the Pacific. But the truth? This territory has experienced 500 years of intensely fragmented history, and it has actually been right at the absolute center of global events. Today, we're unpacking a region whose story is one of unbelievable resilience and dramatic transformation. It's a place where ancient, deep-rooted traditions are constantly colliding with the sharp edge of modern geopolitics.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the vast island empire, move into the waves of colonial empire, cover the Pacific theater, trace the long road to independence, and wrap up with modern challenges and future threats. Section 1. The vast island empire, a macro view. Okay, the sheer math of this region is absolutely staggering. We're talking about 1.5 million square miles of ocean. To put that into perspective, that vast expanse connects roughly just 20,000 square miles of actual land scattered across thousands of discontinuous islands. But here's the thing. To the early inhabitants, this massive ocean wasn't some huge barrier keeping everyone isolated. Not at all. It was their highway. It was their grocery store, and it was the primary way they connected across these astonishing distances. It's really best to think of it as an empire of water, where the sea actually unites people rather than divides them. So the people living here were anything but isolated. They built these complex matrilineal clan networks and relied on highly intricate canoe navigation to cross hundreds of miles of open water. And the local diversity in their social structures was incredible. For instance, in Pompeii, the Sodler dynasty commanded this impressive, mysterious stone architecture built right on top of high mountains and artificial islets. And over in the West, on Satawal, local myths tell us about two villages separated by a massive lagoon that actually transmitted messages using crafted toy-like wooden gliders. They would literally just ride the coastal winds to communicate. I mean, these pre-colonial networks were incredibly vibrant, deeply adapted to their environments, and just remarkably sophisticated. Section 2. Waves of Colonial Empire, a Rapid Succession. Now, over just a few centuries, control of these islands shifted violently and rapidly. And I mean rapidly. It created this profound psychological whiplash for the native populations. Starting in 1565, Spain rolls in and establishes a presence that lasts over 3 centuries. Then, looking for coaling stations, Germany steps in and negotiates a treaty in 1885. Right after that, during World War I, Japan swiftly takes control by 1914. And finally, after World War II, the United States takes over administration in 1947. This timeline is literally a complete, repeated disruption of thousands of years of indigenous continuity. Just as a generation finally figured out how to adapt to one empire's rules, a totally new one arrived and rewrote the whole playbook. And the cultural devastation from all this shifting was immense. You had these deeply traditional, non-centralized networks, canoes, local chiefdoms, reciprocal relationships between coastal and highland peoples, and they were abruptly forced to accommodate massive Asian and Pacific merchant trade. The colonial era brought in foreign ships and forced wage labor, specifically in the copra trade. Copra is dried coconut meat used for oil, and sometimes islanders were forced to manually move 400 tons of it at a time. The new rulers introduced strict taxation and totalitarian mandates that actively tore apart traditional hierarchies. At one point, authorities even discouraged or outright banned traditional music and chanting. They were actively trying to erase the local cultural identity. Section 3. The Pacific Theater. Collision Course. Things took a very dark turn when the Japanese mandate shifted its approach from trade integration to full-on military terror. By 1939, they started converting these tiny, peaceful islets into heavily fortified strongholds. Can you imagine the sheer terror of that? Waking up as a peaceful islander to find your pristine atolls, especially places like Truk and the Marianas, being completely transformed. They poured large, reinforced concrete bunkers directly onto the beaches and built these massive airstrips designed specifically to withstand heavy bombardment. The locals were basically trapped in a nightmare as their ancestral homes were violently militarized. Because of this, islands that had absolutely no initial stake in global warfare were utterly decimated. After Pearl Harbor, American forces launched incredibly fierce air, land, and sea assaults, heavily targeting the Marianas. Truk, which was the final fortified outpost of colonial Japan, finally fell to the Americans in June 1944. And when the violence subsided and the smoke cleared, that heavily fortified enemy stronghold didn't go back to being a peaceful island. It was simply repurposed into an American headquarters and a massive rusting salvage depot.
The fragile local landscape of these islands was fundamentally and permanently altered.
Section 4. Long Road to Independence, the Trust Territory.
So, following the war, we enter the U.S. era, which was honestly just full of massive contradictions. On one hand, the paltry investments from previous empires were suddenly replaced by exponential development. The U.S. brought in modern infrastructure and, thankfully, introduced moratoriums on atomic testing in the Central Pacific. But on the other hand, the administration was notoriously disconnected. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't just disconnected, it was often deeply patronizing. Some government officials infamously referred to the locals as their, quote, little Micronesian buddies. And beneath the surface of all this, complex ethnic tensions were boiling. Why? Because the U.S. arbitrarily lumped these highly diverse, historically completely separate island cultures into single, massive administrative units, and basically told them to figure out a shared political future. This complex mess eventually led to the Compact of Free Association. This was the hard-fought legal framework that finally allowed entities like the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia to emerge as independent, self-governing nations in 1986. But, it was a massive double-edged sword. Yes, it granted them autonomy, but it also deeply tethered their economic and defense realities to the United States. It was independence, for sure, but with very heavy strings attached. These new nations relied heavily on U.S. federal grants just for basic survival, while simultaneously giving the U.S. military exclusive strategic denial rights over their massive territorial waters. Which brings us to a fascinating question. What happens when an ancient island culture completely collides with the 21st century? After centuries of colonial rule, they finally achieved self-government. But what does modern life actually look like on these islands today, as their ancient traditions meet our hyper-globalized world? Section 5. Modern Challenges, Future Threats. Well, today, it is the ultimate modern paradox. Look at their economy. On the export side, high-tech fishing and foreign joint ventures are pulling massive wealth right out of Micronesian waters. We are talking over $99 million in premium tuna alone back in the 1990s, and way more today. But ordinary Micronesians, they aren't really seeing that wealth. In fact, local diets have drastically shifted because of a heartbreaking loss of local agricultural knowledge. Instead of their traditional, sustainable diets of warm rice or freshly caught dried fish, citizens are increasingly eating imported, pre-manufactured hot bread and instant frozen chow mein that you just pop in the microwave. It's a completely wild disconnect. And zooming back into daily life, technology has totally rewired their social fabric. When mobile phones arrived in places like Pompeii or on 2006, they changed absolutely everything. Sure, they supercharged daily logistics. It became incredibly easy to send out instant church alerts for funerals or to quickly rent a boat from a neighbor. But it also opened up this huge gap for non-communicative behavior. In a really bitter irony, a device that was literally built to connect people actually started fracturing their community ties. It replaced the face-to-face trust that these societies had relied on for hundreds of years with these instantaneous, rapidly distorting gossip networks. And if that wasn't enough, these communities are battling a whole gauntlet of powerful external pressures. You've got the growing threat of mass tourism, which too often just commodifies their culture into an exotic other, reducing these deeply rich, sacred traditions into cheap souvenirs for visitors. Then, on a strictly practical level, commercial aviation is constantly clashing with local wildlife. This creates major physical hazards at civilian airports, and mitigating those risks directly conflicts with vital local environmental protections. But looming above all of this, the absolute biggest issue is the existential threat of climate change. Rising seas are actively threatening their beach resources, eroding ancient cultural sites, and endangering their very way of life. So it leaves us with this powerful, pressing paradox. We are looking at a deeply resilient people. They survived the arrival of Spanish galleons, they endured strict Japanese mandates, and they lived through the absolute devastation of World War II bombers. They fought tooth and nail to reclaim their independence. Yet now, after all that, they find themselves at the absolute global ground zero for climate change. How will they navigate this new, rising tide? It's a massive question that extends far beyond the borders of Micronesia. But one thing is for sure, the answer is undoubtedly going to be written on these islands first.